Hi, everybody, and welcome. How's everybody doing? Good. So welcome to our session, Women on the Front Lines of Disaster Response. This is going to be an exciting session today, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing our host, Tae Yu, who is the Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Corporate Social Responsibility, or CSR, in Cisco. Tae leads Cisco's investment and stewards CSR and sustainability across the business, including the company's humanitarian and disaster response efforts. She directs Cisco's business, technical, and financial assets to accelerate global problem solving to positively impact people, society, and our planet. Under Tae's leadership, corporate affairs is committed to positively impacting 1 billion people by 2025 by inspiring, connecting, and investing in global problem solvers who promote and accelerate the adoption of breakthrough technologies, products, and services that drive economic development and/or solve social or environmental problems. Corporate affairs also invests in developing digital skills so everyone can participate in our digital economy. A founding Cisco employee, Tae pioneered Cisco's business development, establishing new markets through partnerships for joint product and market development. Under her leadership, the Cisco Networking Academy, this program has become one of the largest ICT education programs worldwide, helping 1.6 million students get jobs since 2005. She is also a trustee of the Cisco Foundation, a member of the Service Year Alliance Board, and the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Education, Gender, and Work. So please welcome your host for today, our session, Women on the Front Lines of Disaster Response, Tae Yu.
Thank you. So thanks everybody for coming. It's right after lunch, so I realize that I'm in danger of facing the after meal slump. But I think this is going to be really exciting. When we talk about disasters, I just want to take a moment to reflect on just this past year, 2017, and the disasters that we all experience globally. So there was Hurricane Harvey that impacted Texas. There were the floods in Peru and India. There was earthquakes in Mexico and China. There was Hurricane Irma that impacted the Caribbean and southeastern United States. There was Hurricane Maria that decimated Puerto Rico. And then there were wildfires in California and Canada. And then there was famine in Somalia and Nigeria and Yemen and South Sudan. And that doesn't even include the ongoing refugee crisis. So all of this happened in 1 year. And when things like this happen, I'm always heartened and enlightened and excited and inspired by just the calls we get. Everybody reaches out, not just our employees for sure, but also our partners in the ecosystem. And they all want to know, how can I help? What can I do to get engaged? And our first gut reaction is to say, well, let me write a check, let me send a blanket, let me send food and water. But the reality is, and this is why it's so important, and I'm excited to have all of you here, is that at the center of all that, at the nerve center of responding to this, is technology and communications. So how do you know where you're going to go? How do you know who needs what? How do aid workers reach out and say, we need this kind of support? How does the government know, the local government, the national government know that they have to restore water in these places? There's a safety issue. How do we know if the work that we're doing overlaps with somebody else's work? How do we know that maybe what the work I can do can actually complement someone else's work? And so at the end of the day, the technology infrastructure becomes critical, and it will enable us to think about incorporating changes because people are on the ground. We had worked with Ushahidi, which is a crowdsourcing application, and what they did is they actually opened it up so that they can hear from people on the ground in social media in terms of safety and what's happening. So how do we incorporate all of that? And when we do this, I'm always really inspired and grateful to the people who go onto the front lines. And these are obviously the people you expect, the military, firefighters, police officers, emergency management teams, but the people who stay behind in the hospitals to take care of. I mean, just think about the fear and the vulnerability of families who have a loved one in a hospital that has to, the hurricane's coming there. How do we move them? Where do we move them? And then you think about the nonprofit organizations who go in there. These are aid workers and volunteers. And then there are people just like all of us in here who want to do something. And so we really are blessed with, an abundance of people who want to get engaged. And particularly, there are a lot of women who are on the front lines. And so today, we have the pleasure of having two very special women. One is Lauren Woodman, the CEO of NetHope, and then the other is our own, Sue-Lynn Hinson, who runs the Tactical Operations organization for Cisco. So could you all join me on stage? Lauren got dressed up for us. I mean, that's dedication. Thank you. Okay. Hi, Sue-Lynn. Okay. Do you want to take a seat? All right. So what we want to do is make this really interactive. So I'm going to tee up a few questions, get you familiar with them, the work that they do, and then what we want to do is open it up to all of you. And we can take it in any direction you want to take it. If you want to go down to technology level and ideas you have, let's just get it all out there, because that's what this is. It's really a conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Lauren. You are the CEO of an organization called NetHope, whom I'm very familiar with. But could you share with the audience what you do and how you operate?
Sure. Thank you all for joining us here, and thanks for having the opportunity to have this conversation. NetHope is a consortium of the world's largest 57 humanitarian development and conservation organizations and the tech sector.
Can you give them examples of what some of the, because
so
they're names
all organizations Mercy Corps, Save the Children, the International Federation of the Red Cross, the World Wildlife Nature Conservancy, large multinational global organizations that work in the range of things, from first response and emergency response to ongoing humanitarian needs, to ongoing development needs, to saving the climate and the environment. And we work very closely with the tech sector to try and figure out how do we use promising technologies in solving these problems. We were co-founded 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Oh my gosh, that's amazing to say. Almost 20 years ago by Cisco. And so Cisco's been a close partner of ours for years and years and years. And we've learned through these sort of close relationship with technology partners how we can bring technology in to address some of these challenges that we all know exist.
And by the way, we were all 12 years old when we started NetHope, so we were very young. So I'm going to turn to you, Sue-Lynn. First of all, it's a very intimidating title you have, Tactical Operations. I mean, I just think of, kind of the way you're dressed, but with tactical gear and hitting the ground running and things like that. So can you share, and you also, in your personal life, you used to be a volunteer firefighter. Can you imagine picking up all that equipment? So so you're well suited to this. Can you share with them a little bit about what TacOps does and maybe a little bit about how you got there?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thanks, Tay, for the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate everybody's time today. So Cisco's Tactical Operations, or TacOps as we like to call it, is a highly skilled and dedicated team that deploys people and equipment into the acute phase of a disaster. So we provide secure communication solutions to help the nonprofit organizations, the government agencies, the folks like the NetHope organizations that are facilitating humanitarian disaster relief to do their jobs with the communication. So it's I like to say the coolest job at Cisco, I think, that we have. But we get to go to these places and help people. But the really cool part of it is that it is part of Cisco's corporate social responsibility, and we don't charge anything for the services that we provide, the people, the equipment, or anything. So Cisco really focuses on trying to give back to the community in these times of need.
So when you think about just the number of disasters, I mean, obviously, the biggest challenge is people. So how do you find people to go with you? Because this is not you have a small team. Could you share kind of how you operate? Because there might be some volunteers in this audience.
Absolutely. So we are a very small team. The full-time team that I have is 8 folks, but split between North Carolina and California. So all of the disasters that Tay mentioned earlier, we couldn't possibly do it all by ourselves. So we have a pretty extensive network of volunteers who are also Cisco employees. We call them DIRT volunteers, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek because they get dirty doing the job, but it actually stands for Disaster Incident Response Team. And so these Cisco employees are trained in our solutions, in our response processes, and when we have big disasters or multiple disasters, like Tay was mentioning, they come with us to those deployments and help us.
And how do you cycle them in? Because, the biggest challenge is that you go off and volunteer, but your work stays there. So you have to have really good co-workers and managers who really want to support you. So what's the process if somebody's interested in that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So you're right, it has to have manager support, and we've never had a problem with that within Cisco. I mean, everyone down from Chuck Robbins all the way through the leadership team to the managers are so supportive of all of the work that Cisco does to help the community. So DIRT volunteers get the approval of their managers, and then we typically cycle them out, maybe if it's going to be a long extended deployment, about every 2 weeks, or depending on how how their schedules can manage it. We do try to cycle people out so that they're not stuck on an extended deployment for too long.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Lauren, in any disaster, like any ecosystem, you need that ecosystem, right? I mean, it's public sector, it's private sector, the NGO or nonprofit sector, churches, religious institutions, average citizens who just happen to be walking by. NetHope has a very unique role in bringing all this together. Can you share with the audience a little bit about how you operate?
Yeah, we do a couple of different things, and one of my colleagues, Frank Scott, who's been doing this for a long time, likens NetHope to a symphony conductor, in the sense that we try and coordinate all of those different roles. And you can imagine in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, everybody wants to help. And if we're not careful, we can fall over one another. And so it's important, especially for the first responding organizations, to come together and say, okay, who's doing what? You're going to work on this, and we're going to work on this, and you're going to work on this, and then to come together every morning. And we run a war room is a terrible thing to call the process that we do in the middle of a humanitarian disaster, but we run a situation analysis every morning to say, what did we learn yesterday? What needs more attention? What needs less attention? And over the years, as we've perfected this across I wouldn't say perfected this, as we've improved this across the organizations with which we work, we've also realized that there are some tasks that everybody does that we can offload. And that, part of that is communications, especially working so closely with Cisco and coming in and saying, it doesn't make sense for 20 organizations to bring in emergency telecommunications. We can do that work, we can do that with our partners, and we can make that available to all responders. We've also started to move into the area of data analytics, and what are we learning? What are we seeing? Can we create situation analyses and informatics out of that so that everyone has the same version of the truth as to what's happening on the ground? And that's those types of things, that sort of central coordinating role, make sure that organizations that frankly are already strapped resource-wise, are able to deploy their resources most effectively, and we can all agree on sort of what the highest priority needs are, and make sure that we're allocating the right resources to those types of things.
One of the things that I found was interesting, and we're going to come back to you a little bit, but I remember Haiti, and the hardest thing is that we didn't know who was in charge. So why don't you noodle on that while we talk technology for a minute? So Sue-Lynn, this is our, Cisco Live. A lot of people interested in technologies. Can you talk more specifically about the type of technologies you deployed and the unique differentiator that, the thing that made it, the thing that threw us over to the other side and we saw the light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, so communications really is at the foundation of so much of the work that's done today. And I think we take it a little bit for granted, but when the disaster hits and the tornado comes and you don't have electricity and your internet is down and you don't have cell service, suddenly you realize just how much that communications is really woven into the fabric of everyday life, right? So this is our sweet spot at Cisco and at Tactical Operations. So we provide a variety of communication services, including wired and wireless internet connectivity, IP telephony services, video teleconferencing, video surveillance, radio interoperability, all those kinds of things that nonprofits and the responding organizations need to do their jobs on the ground, right? So we have a variety of solutions. Some of them are pictured up here on the screen, and we've got some of our equipment, the network emergency response vehicle. Some of you may have seen that already on the World of Solutions show floor. So that's a really nice package. It's a mobile command solution that has a lot of those technologies built into it. And then for some of the other, like the international responses that we do where we can't necessarily put the truck on the plane, we have portable kits that we've designed and built based on Cisco equipment, iOS and Meraki gear that we can ship internationally.
Okay. There was this great big blow-up balloon that you had. You want to tell them a little bit about it?
Yeah, so that is an inflatable satellite antenna. It's made by a company called Gator. I think they're actually called Cubic now. But it's really neat because one of the challenges that we face, especially with international deployments, is the difficulty in getting the gear overseas, right? So it's a tremendous hassle to ship things. So a big satellite dish, like the one that's on top of our truck, weighs thousands of pounds, and you can't exactly put that in a box and ship it overseas. So the Gator antenna is an inflatable satellite, and it's a big beach ball looking thing. You might see it out on the show floor if you go out there today. And the cool thing about it is that it deflates, and it fits into a couple of cases that you can then take with you on an airplane and then go overseas, and you have a satellite antenna at the other end. So this is what we use for some of our international remote responses.
Okay, great. So Lauren, okay, so while Sue-Lynn and the DIRT team, and Rami in NetHope, they all worked together. They were all, and in Puerto Rico, it was almost a cohesive single team. And I don't know if you know this, but Cisco employees lived at the office for 6 weeks. So when you went into the office, they had turned conference rooms into bedrooms. And we have lots of pictures of people sleeping, next on air mattresses next to, in the data center. And, one of the wives actually set up a little table with a little lamp to try and make it homey, and the children were there studying. But while they were in need, they actually went out to work with I guess it was the mayor's office and the first responders to help everybody else. So they were living it real time. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting is the coordination that it takes. And I remember in Haiti, it was very difficult. Can you talk a little bit about, what do you do in a situation like that?
Yeah, the coordination role becomes really critical. And without coordination, what you get is chaos. And to Chuck Speaks this morning, what you don't get is the wonder, right? You just get the chaos. And I think Haiti response was certainly plagued by a lack of coordination. Now, when you have a crisis that's in a single place, like a Puerto Rico or Haiti, typically you have a government office that is helping to coordinate. In Haiti, that wasn't the case. In Puerto Rico, that was the case. We had great cooperation with the government, with the Commonwealth government. But you still had a tremendous amount of coordination that needed to happen, and you had local mayors that were asking for assistance. You had, first responders that were going out to do situation assessments, that were bringing information back. And so, in those situations, it's very helpful to have, especially someone in charge, really from the government, that can help can help direct aid and help make sure that we all know who's playing what role. If you look at a multi-country crisis like Ebola, it was a much more difficult situation because we had multiple countries involved. We had governments that had different levels of willingness to address the problem at hand.
And why is that?
Liberia and Sierra Leone were great at welcoming international aid, and in Guinea we had just tremendous resistance to having outside aid.
Why?
It was a cultural thing. They thought outsiders were bringing in Ebola. I mean, it was just to the point that the World Health Organization worked with Benetton to try and get Benetton to design World Health Organization costumes that looked like local dress, so that, just to ease some of the acceptance issues. And I wouldn't say that was wholly successful.
Okay.
But we had some real issues. Now, we did have the World Health Organization that was coming in and trying to sort of, play a pan-country role. but even then, you had relative levels of success in doing that, and ultimately it ended up that the United States really ended up taking the lead in Liberia. The UK took the lead in Sierra Leone, and between those two governments that had, responsive organizations, and in addition to World Health, and then working very closely with the nonprofits that were on the ground. It took all of that coordination for us to finally get the virus under control. And it wasn't really until we figured out how to engage local organizations and frankly churches and religious organizations in some of the Muslim populations for us to be able to bring the virus under control.
So that leads me to a question about, information is aid, and you've been very, very active in that space. Could you share with the audience a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, and I think that's, let me go back to Ebola and then lead up to Puerto Rico, because there's a trajectory there that makes a lot of sense. When we first started responding to Ebola, if folks kind of remember the crisis, we really started seeing the virus in about March or April, and sometime around sort of late summer, it really hit the international consciousness, and people were, really beginning to think about the Ebola crisis that was at that point in time sort of raging out of control. And by the end of September, so 4 weeks after it had really sort of hit the front pages, there was an article in the New York Times that said, "We've turned the corner. For the first time, Ebola infection rates are down. In Liberia, infection rates are down. Whatever we're doing, it's working fantastic. Everybody can breathe a sigh of relief." And it was just after the World Health Organization had come out and said, if we don't get this thing under control, we're talking about 1 million Ebola cases by Christmas. And so 2 very, very different scenarios. The problem is that it was true. The number of cases that were reported were down, but that was because there was no communications in Liberia. And so when we actually did the map that said, look, here's Liberia, here's where infection rates are rising or decreasing based on the recent things, here's where Ebola treatment units currently exist and where they're being planned, and here's where connectivity exists or doesn't. There was a direct inverse relationship between where infection rates were rising and where there was connectivity. And which makes total sense. If you don't have connectivity, you can't tell people that more people are getting sick, right? And so we realized that that was a huge problem. And that single map, more than anything else, I think, frankly, that we did during the entire process was absolutely critical in starting to shift the perception that we needed to focus on communications in order to get accurate information both out and into affected communities. One of the things that we also realized, though, was that the affected communities were very effective when they were empowered with the right information to help their neighbors and their friends and their families find access to aid. So one of the things that we've done in Puerto Rico is this Information is Aid campaign. How do you take citizens, turn them into reporters, send them out, and let them tell us what's happening on the ground? Where is water? Where is power? Where is communications? Where are those things still needed? And more importantly, to arm them with the information that they need rather than, and I hate to use this phrase, fake news running around that isn't the right information that actually gets people to aid. Because rumors happen. Rumors happen even in the best of times, certainly in a time of chaos when you're trying to find access to water or trying to diesel to power your generator, whatever the case may be. You don't want to use the last resources you have chasing something that's wrong. And so that idea that we have to be able to provide reliable information and we have to be able to get reliable information in order to effectively execute aid is really, really critical, but it also relies on technology for us to be able to do that. So going back to technology a little bit, I think that privacy becomes a really important component because sometimes in man-made disasters, people are running away from something, and they're also could be targets, and it could be anything from the tribe you belong to. It might be at odds with another tribe, and both of you end up in a refugee camp, in the same refugee camp. Can you talk a little bit about, what we need to do, both of you, what we are doing, what we need to do, and how much of it is technology and how much of it is policy?
Yeah, well, I'll start from the technology standpoint. You know, people think, well, a humanitarian network, or you're putting up a temporary network for humanitarian purposes. Who in the world would want to hack a humanitarian operation, right? But then you think a little bit further, and you're like, okay, these organizations are bringing in supplies, they're bringing in fuel, they've got medications, you know, and all of that. And so that really makes them kind of a target for, you know, for bad things to happen. So making sure that the networks are secure, so that information doesn't get out to people that maybe, you know, might have not so good intentions, really becomes important. And then, as Lauren was saying before, these people that are in these situations are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, right? So they may be running from political conflict at home, or they, you know, running from some situation, and to have their personal data out there that, again, you know, maybe they're victims or you know, are ripe for human trafficking kind of operations, right? So we have to be able to protect those people. And with Cisco's technologies, you know, we have a lot of advanced security technologies that are actually built into the network, right? So with the things in the Meraki equipment, you know, we're able to monitor and block a lot of the bad traffic that happens on the network.
And that is, you know, when you think about biometric data and how important that is, because when you have a disaster and you have children whose parents have perished, they become prime targets for human trafficking. And being able to track them and know them if they try and cross borders with children, even if they're posing as their own children, the fact that they have to, you know, do the fingerprint or the iris scan or whatever the biometric is at that point in time, which is getting much more sophisticated, could really save lives there. Okay. So Lauren, what about you? What's your, in terms of policy and other things that are programmatic things?
Yeah, I think we're getting, you know, I think in the humanitarian sector, you know, we've kind of gone, you know, from we don't need data, we just provide aid, to, oh my gosh, data is so amazing, and look at all the stuff we can do, and we can learn so much from it, we can do humanitarian work so much more effective, to, oh my gosh, hold on a second, maybe we don't know how to protect this data as well as we think we should. And you know, I think especially over the last couple of years, where we have seen data become a target for exactly the political reasons that you're saying. I mean, I met a family in Greece last year that had escaped from Afghanistan. They had never, frankly, been involved in the conflict, but he had worked for a local Afghani company that had provided logistics support to U.S. aid missions. That made him, and his wife and children had gone to a U.S. aid clinic in order to get vaccines and medicine and whatnot. That made them collaborators with the Americans, and they had ended up being targeted and had to walk to Greece. And so, you know, the fact that someone goes to a clinic that is run by someone that you don't like, if that makes you a collaborator, that's data that we absolutely want to make sure that we don't get out there. And so I think there's been a real recognition over the last couple of years in the humanitarian sector that as much attention as we spend, you know, looking at the physical security of both aid workers and the communities that we serve, recognizing that, you know, we need to be careful with the communities that we serve. There's also a growing recognition that the data that we have about them must be protected in similar ways. And that has been a very hard mental shift for folks who still think that on-prem and strong passwords are the right way to go, and that we're still kind of working through some of those issues with some of our with some teams. But you know, I think folks are recognizing that you know, it's not your grandmother's crisis anymore, right? This is much more sophisticated. The enemies are much more sophisticated, and we require much more sophisticated tools in order to protect these populations.
Yeah. So can we shift just a little bit to, you know, that's crisis relief and recovery, but then there's also the rebuilding of lives. And we were about 3 weeks ago, we were in northern Uganda, in Bidi Bidi and Arua, the Rhino camp, which Bidi Bidi didn't exist 2 years ago. It now has a population of 270,000 people. That they call that home. And this is the new normal. Some of them are wondering, you know, when can I go home? Some of them don't know what their futures look like. Uganda has a very interesting approach, which is that they have accepted the refugees and let them integrate into the local community. They give them, Rwanda is lucky enough to have land, so they give them some land. It's an, you know, agricultural environment. But what happens is how do you get them recovered? And the first thing, Mary was with me, and we were sitting there talking to them, and they kept saying, you know, I have a sewing business. I You know, I can provide services. All of a sudden, 270,000 refugees become potential customers. You do some work around there, and you've seen that. And you know, can you talk about what you put together at Rhino Camp, and then some of the programs that you do, you know, in Kenya and other places?
Sure, absolutely. So in the camps in Uganda, we set up Meraki-based Wi-Fi hotspots. So we were focusing on the NGOs that are operating in the area, their field offices, as well as in the refugee camps. And the reason that that's important is because you think about these people that are in these refugee camps, they may be there for potentially years, right? So you have kids that, you know, where are they going to get an education? Where are people going to get job skills? And how are they going to get jobs to actually have a future? And the connectivity gives them the ability to do that, right? So with the connectivity, they can now bring in distance learning classes, the networking academy that Cisco is bringing into Uganda. That gives them the opportunity to get the training and the skills that they need to actually continue with their lives in as normal a way as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sue-Lynn's exactly right. I mean, the connectivity gives folks an opportunity to connect and find jobs and get skills.
What was the first thing you said to me? You told me a year and a half ago when somebody ends up in a refugee camp, there's two questions that they always ask.
Yeah, when refugees land in Europe, the first question they ask is, "Where am I?" And if they're in Europe, they get out of the boat, and if not, they get back in the water. The second question they ask is, "Do you have Wi-Fi?" That's the very second question that people ask. Before they ask for food, water, blankets, medical care, anything else, is, do you have Wi-Fi? And the thing that refugees want to do is they want to be able to connect with their loved ones to let them know that they're safe. And there's such a high mortality rate crossing the sea that people want to let people know that they're safe. But it does open up the opportunities for refugees to start to put their lives back together or to find a new path because most of them, frankly, aren't going home. I mean, we're on our third generation in Dadaab in northeastern Kenya. It's been there 42 years. And on a busy year, it's got 700,000 people in it. And it's the third largest city in Kenya. So.
And how did that come to be?
Out of the famine in Somalia. And every time that we don't get rains in Somalia, the population in Dadaab goes right back up. There are kids that have been born, gotten married, had their own children, and are still living in Dadaab, and they've never left the camp. No, it's lower now. The population's lower right now. They've been trying to figure out how to repatriate refugees out of Dadaab, but some of them are actually quite skilled. And it's fascinating. There's actually I live in Seattle. There's actually a large Somali population in Seattle, and there was something on the local news maybe 6 months ago of families in Dadaab and local Seattle families that had relocated to Seattle talking. And I was watching these guys on Skype and chit-chatting, and he was talking about he was going to school and he was learning IT skills, and it was really pretty fascinating that that was being facilitated by the tech sector and the nonprofits working together because there was connectivity in Dadaab, and it didn't exist until 3 or 4 years ago. So that is a huge piece. But I think you're absolutely right. Refugees come to a refugee situation with skills. I mean, they don't, and certainly if we look at the refugee crises over the last couple of years, some of them are highly skilled. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so trying to find a way to help folks connect with the outside world, to find a place to safe passage when they land in their country of asylum or wherever they've been relocated and they find a place to be, helping them find a job becomes really critical. And some of the work that we've done in Germany and retraining folks, and some of the work that we've done with the No Lost Generation and providing a basic education to kids and then vocational training across all of our partners has been really critical in helping folks start to rebuild their lives.
Yeah. It's interesting because we were in Berlin in April, and Fran Katsudis and part of her leadership team. So we were in Berlin, and it was a day where they had a lot of Network Academy students, and 3 of them were women from Syria. And what's interesting is that they had finished their training, and when the senator from the Berlin Senate was speaking, the refugees were translating for me in English what they were hearing in German, which is their second language. So it was kind of fascinating through that process. Can we talk a little bit what you've learned? I mean, everyone always talks about all the great things that happen, but there's some painful things that happen as well. You shared something that happened in the refugee camps. One of the ones in Greece. And, what are the lessons that you've learned? Let's start with you, Lauren. And by the way, Lauren's background, she actually worked for Microsoft, so she comes from a technology, the technology sector. And when we worked at NetHope, NetHope was really, Ed Granger happened, he was with Save the Children, he was the CIO. And what he saw, and I saw this firsthand in Afghanistan in 2002 when we went to open a network academy there. You go down the road and you have Save the Children US, Save the Children UK, Care US, Care Canada, and those are franchises within their own institutions, and he wanted to find a way that all these humanitarian organizations could be coordinated, create a collaborative, so because not everybody has a CIO. In fact, most NGOs don't have a CIO, and seeing how important the technology was. And so that's how it came to be. And Cisco employees, 2 of them actually were working with Ed to create NetHope, and then Microsoft, and then we seconded some people there, and then Microsoft came in, and then Intel came in, and so NetHope really belongs to the tech sector, I think, and not to any one company. But can you just talk about, and when you showed up, you were like a professional, somebody who came out of the sector, understood the sector and the mission of the organization. What have you learned through the process? What were some of the painful things that happened?
There's so many. I've been in NetHope now for almost 5 years, and it has been a true every day is a learning experience. But there've been a lot of things I've learned. I think a couple of things. One, I think that it is our perception of the nonprofit sector is that nonprofits are by and large really far behind on technology, really, really far behind on technology, and for the most part, that's true. But it's not always true. And there are some nonprofits that are doing some really amazing things with technology. And when you compare that, on average in the private sector, most companies spend somewhere between 8 and 12% of their budgets on IT investment across the board, and nonprofits spend somewhere around 1 to 2%. 2.25% is considered just absolutely luxurious to have that kind of IT budget. You realize that we really are dealing with very constrained scenarios. And so what nonprofits don't do particularly well is IT at scale. But they do neat stuff with technology in unique situations. And so part of the challenge has been, one, trying to combat some of those perceptions, because I think it limits what people think we can do. And there's a tremendous amount that's possible. We just have to think about how we resource it more smartly. And I'm not even talking about more money, just more smartly, and how we do things more collaboratively. And 2, I think that it was a surprise to me when I left the tech sector how much faster tech works than everybody else in the world. And I know everybody's like, it's Microsoft was slow. Okay, Microsoft was absolutely rocket speed compared to the nonprofit sector. But we also work with consumer product companies and with governments and with everybody works slower than tech, period. And then nonprofits also have some structural issues in the way that we're funded and the way that we work with governments. It makes us really slow. And so the gulf is quite big. And while I do think that there's a lot that we can do together, I think, frankly, the nonprofit side has to do a lot more. And we just haven't pushed ourselves hard enough. And that's painful, because I think for organizations that are mission driven and want to do the right thing, sometimes our passions are directed in the wrong way, and that's hard for us to accept. The other thing I think that's been just sort of personally painful is the recognition that you can't solve all the problems all the time. And I'm sure you've had this experience, and you've had this experience.
And nobody out here has had this experience.
Right, you just, I was in a refugee camp in Greece, and I was, this is a picture I'll treasure forever, but me and these 3 little girls, and they're, the same ages as my daughters, and we're all sitting around, and we're playing, and I'm just like, I'll just take you home. I just decided that, you're just gonna come with me, which is a totally ridiculous statement, because they had loving parents who had gotten them to this point and found them a place that was safe and taught them English. So they were clearly very well cared for, and just in an unfortunate circumstance. And 2, there's also about 300 other kids in this one camp, and there's 50 camps across Greece. So it's not a question of swooping in and solving. It is a question of empowering. And that has been a real hard shift for me, just mentally and sort of emotionally, to recognize that you got to do what you got to do, and then you've got to be able to step back so that you can go do more and empower more people. And that's hard to do sometimes.
It's very hard to do, you're right. Sue-Lynn, any?
For us, I think, something that we've learned over the years is just the importance of building relationships, right? So when the disaster hits and it all hits the fan is not the time to cold call somebody and say, hey, we're here to help, right? So, building relationships with organizations like NetHope ahead of time and doing the training and the pre-planning and where are we going to put the equipment and how are we going to deploy and who's going to do what, that takes a lot of time and effort, and doing that before the disaster strikes is really important. So that's something that we've really tried to improve upon over the years, is trying to have those relationships beforehand. And of course, it's a never-ending battle, right? Because the places that you build with a relationship is not the place that the disaster happens. It always happens in some little island out in the middle of nowhere that you have no idea who these people are, right? So, just that's a constant battle for us. And then with the technology, as much as things advance and as quickly as things advance in the technology world, we have to keep up with that. And so one of the things that we do after every disaster and after everything that happens, we have after-action reviews, right? So we've gone through this with NetHope and some of the other organizations too. But every situation is a learning experience, and so you have to look back and see, okay, how can we do things better? So just that continuous improvement.
Okay, great. So now we're going to shift. By the way, the clock's not working, so I just wanted to, I'm assuming I'm on time here. Great. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have a mic for her? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I don't think she wants to stand. She doesn't have to stand up. We have roving mics. We're good. Yeah.
Just a real basic question. Is all the equipment waterproof?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. We've actually had some problems with water leaks in the truck, so your mileage may vary with that. Waterproof, I wouldn't say. Some of the kits that we have, the portable kits, they really can't be outside in the rain, right? So we do have to figure out places that we can put them that have shelter. Theoretically, everything in the trucks should be protected from the weather. One thing to note is that they are not bulletproof. People ask us all the time about the trucks, are they bulletproof? Are they, and they're not, so we try not to go where the bullets fly.
Okay, well.
Not your typical everyday going to work on the main campus.
Right.
Yeah, question, yeah.
Yes.
Outside of the Cisco Foundation, what is your primary sources of funding?
From a NetHope perspective?
And within the work that the Cisco teams do.
So we get a tremendous amount of in-kind support from the TacOps team. I mean, Sue-Lynn does not want me to, talk about how amazing her team is, but her team is amazing. She is amazing, and these guys do really hard work in really hard places, and they do it really well. And everybody who comes in touch with them thinks that they're the nicest people in the world. And if you can maintain that, they are. If you can maintain that in the chaos of an emergency, I mean, you're truly a remarkable person and truly a remarkable entity. And so they have done a very good job at building relationships and having the expertise and sharing that expertise and doing the hard work in between the crises that allow them to be so effective in those crises. And frankly, it's made organizations like NetHope and our member organizations better because of it, frankly. From a NetHope perspective, so we get funding from TacOps, in-kind support from TacOps, and we also, at times, get grants from CSR, direct grants from CSR outside the foundation. We as an organization are almost 100% funded by corporate donations. So our members pay dues, but as part of our overall budgets every year, it's a relatively small portion, but we say it's a pay-to-play model. It is a pay-to-play model. It's not a pay-to-get, and so people come and they really do work together and roll up their sleeves and share and all that kind of stuff, and that's our expectation. And part of the reasons that companies have been willing to support NetHope is because they can do just that, and you get to support 57 organizations all at once. Those organizations work in about 190 countries around the world, so most of them, they do a tremendous amount of work. We represent about 68% of all international aid, so I mean, it's a pretty big footprint. But in order for that to work, those organizations have to be willing to share. And that's, frankly, part of the price of being part of that. And that is attractive from a corporate perspective because it allows companies to do CSR, frankly, at scale.
Yeah, and because, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do this and why Intel and Microsoft and a whole slew of other companies love this is that they and their employees, we and our employees want to get engaged, but we are not physically in 190 countries. And yet our employees have family who hail from all over the world, no matter at any given point in time. And this is a way for us to be able to ensure that we can get engaged, and we do this through enabling employees, not just to volunteers, dirt volunteers. Not everybody can go to, Uganda. People have children and parents that they're taking care of, but they want to do something. And so we create an environment where they can get engaged with their money, with their expertise, have confidence that this organization has been vetted and that they adhere to legal, moral, ethical standards, because all of our brands are tied to that. And that's why they've been so successful.
And to answer your question from a TacOps perspective, so we're part of the Security and Trust Organization, so we're funded through there, and then of course with a very close partnership with Corporate Affairs, they provide us with a lot of the funding, the equipment. When a disaster happens, they'll a lot of times purchase the equipment that we need to actually deploy on the disaster. We'll get donations from organizations like Meraki and some of the other ones that we use.
Yeah, Meraki's been
Yeah.
fantastic,
Oh, it's been fantastic,
and and they've been very strategic because of the fact that you can remotely configure them.
That's been a game changer.
It is
for
a
us.
game changer, absolutely.
Because we used to have people on the ground to console into the iOS router and to do things, but with Meraki, we can install it and then go home. And the stuff that's in Greece has been there for 3 years now.
And you haven't set foot in it, right?
We haven't set, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
It's awesome. I mean, we run 40 camps in Greece right now for less than $10,000 a year because of the Meraki installation.
Yeah.
I mean, serving about 500,000 refugees.
Okay. Do you want to?
Could you discuss the process? That is, what happens when the phone rings in the middle of the night? Say, we have X and we need your help, or who's dialing the phone?
So you have a process and we have a process. So our process at Cisco is that we have a group of people who monitor disasters all over the world, and it's because we, our priorities are our employees and our customers. So we need to know when 9/11 happened, we need to make sure our customers are up and running. And by the way, our customers happen to be the Port Authority of New York, some of these public sector institutions, and also the financial district, because they need to keep the economy running, and that was really important. So we go through a process. So there is an incident response that starts, that all happens, and then the machine takes over. So Sue-Lynn's organization is notified, we are notified, and everybody hunkers down on what they do. So our organization will look at, okay, we need to activate. Well, first we get an assessment from the Global Protective Services, are employees impacted? And there's a whole slew of things that happen on the human resources side to make sure their families are notified. Are their families with them? How do we get them out? When it was the Hezbollah Israeli conflict back in 2000 and was it 5 or 6 or so, they all run together. We were working with, you were probably at Microsoft at the time, we were working with Microsoft to evacuate our employees together, and we also evacuated the Digital Opportunities Trust, which is one of our networking philanthropy partners. So we evacuated them together. So there's an employee piece that happens. Then there is the customer piece and the resiliency of the infrastructure. And it's, the first responders, EMTs, hospitals, all of that. And then it's everybody else. And so everybody just plays their role. It's a very well thought out framework. And then we do hourly if we have to, and then eventually tail off into daily. And we also have a war room where all the heads of these organizations come together and do that. But one of the ones we do is we look to see if NetHope can be activated. So you want to share what your process is?
Yeah, so we monitor as well. We're not as large an organization, but we have people around the globe, so it works out from a 24-hour clock perspective. We monitor as well, and when disaster does hit, our first question is always, how many of our member organizations are responding, and is there already an organization that is there that is sufficiently large to play a coordinating role? And if you look at something like the earthquakes in Nepal a couple of years ago. We had, I mean, of our 57 member organizations, 35 of them had offices in Kathmandu, right? I mean, Nepal has just got a lot of nonprofits that work there. And so we added some supplemental emergency communications because none of them were able to carry the load for everyone that was coming in. But we were there for a relatively short period of time. I think we were in and out in probably 4 weeks. You know, compare that to Puerto Rico, where most international nonprofits were not working in an American territory. We had 2 organizations, both faith-based, that were already on the island, not really in a response scenario, but mostly just working with the churches that were there. But there was no one there to carry that scenario. And, you know, a year passed when, or almost a year passed when Hurricane Maria hit. We are still on the ground in Puerto Rico and will be there for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. So for us, it's a question of, you know, whether or not the capabilities already exist. And if they do, then we can simply play a coordinating role without having to go on the ground. And if we do need to go on the ground, then we have a team that goes in, and we have a standby roster when we need to add additional personnel. And then obviously we work very closely with TacOps.
You had a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. Just 2 quick questions. Has there ever been a time when you've had to make a trade-off in, you know, areas that you go to provide the emergency services? And then second, when is the job done? Right? It sounds like their engagements can be, and it may never be done, right? But when do you know it's okay to sort of leave? Because that's got to be a difficult.
Exit strategy is really important.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so in terms of trade-offs, there definitely is, right? I mean, there's so many things that are going on all over the world all the time. You can't possibly, like Lauren said, you can't solve every problem, right? So from our perspective, we prioritize based on public safety and health, right? So those are the most important things that we hit first. So if it's hospitals and, you know, agencies are performing life-saving kind of operations, those are the sorts of things that we prioritize first, and then we have a prioritization process after that to kind of go down the line. So that's how we do that. And in terms of if the job is ever done, sometimes I wonder that myself. But one of the things that we do is we have a transition plan in our minds, right? So whenever we go into a place, we always have in mind how we're going to transition and how we're going to come out, right? And that may mean transitioning to some interim solution or some temporary thing that we can then pull some of our temporary equipment out without leaving somebody in a lurch, right? So that's all of the thinking that's going on, and we do that ahead of time, right? So that's we plan for it that way, and then that way, you know, we can pull out gracefully without, you know, again, leaving somebody in the lurch, but we have a plan for that. And a lot of times we're working with our local account teams who have folks in the area. Maybe those are their customers, right? And then they can help us with transitioning smoothly to an interim solution.
And sometimes it's making, you know, there's an NGO that happens to be
Absolutely.
there and works in that area, and, you know, how do we transition to them? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it's similar. And most emergency response organizations have a very well-defined plan as to, you know, what is sort of immediate search and rescue, and, you know, let's take care of everybody who's injured and get them to hospitals. And then there's the sort of short-term recovery plan, and, you know, let's get the trash out of the roads and get the debris cleared away. And then you move into the longer-term recovery phases. And so we tend to do something very similar, which is, you know, we are not, NetHope itself is not a long-term development organization. We are not there to strengthen healthcare systems and those types of things. When we work collectively, it tends to be on the response side. And so when we start to shift into those and those sort of long-term recovery efforts, we do the same thing. Who's going to keep the equipment? Who's going to maintain the equipment? Who's going to keep this up and running until we can phase it down? And typically, we know in advance, you know, that in Ebola, we knew that, you know, we had probably 2 years of runway for communications with the funding that we had available and whatnot. And so you can help organizations sort of plan along that way.
Right. I think we have one more question. Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of dedication and sacrifice that you've probably had to make in your own personal lives. I was curious if you could share a story just in your experience that made it all worth it.
Oh gosh, there's so many. I don't even know where to start. You know, when we go out to these places, just to see the looks on the people's faces when they finally have that communication and they're able to make that phone call to their mother remotely or whatever, or the kid, you know, gets to talk to their parents finally after being on the run for a while, you know, just to see the looks on their faces and the effect that it has on them and the hope that it gives them. That's what makes it worthwhile, right? I mean, it's just, this makes me come to work every day, is knowing that, you know, the team that we have, the organizations like NetHope, just the hope that they can give to people in these dire situations.
Yeah, you know, it is, I would agree. I mean, I think you see hope on people's faces, and that makes all the difference in the world. I will tell you one story, because it's, it is meant not to a room full of technologists, but it is somewhat less maybe photo op ready to go out and put routers up, right, and put telecommunications. It's, you know, you're not coming in with bags of rice and blankets and tents and that kind of stuff. And so it doesn't fit sort of maybe the picture perfect view of what we think of as sort of emergency response. But when I was in Greece, and I was in a camp, it was the old. It was the stadium that they had used for soccer in the 2004 Olympics in Athens, right? And so it's this beautiful green field. I mean, it's just fantastic. And, you know, it's white all around. And because of the situation with the Greek economy, it has fallen into disrepair. It's falling apart, and it's being used as a refugee camp for Afghanis. But I was down, there's a track that runs around the outside of it, and I was down on this track, and we were checking the equipment, because while other people were doing food distribution and medical care, we were climbing up poles to make sure that everything was working, and it was great. And but I met this little girl, and she was about the same age as my youngest daughter, and she just spoke beautiful English. I mean, just perfect English. And so we are talking, and she's introducing me to her friends and all of this kind of stuff. And she has a younger sister who's probably 4, and she's making friendship bracelets out of string, just like, you know, my kids do. And I was showing her pictures of my children on my phone. It was not too far past Halloween. By the way, they don't have Halloween in Afghanistan. That made no sense whatsoever. It says, why are your children dressed like that? And you're like, yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that, actually. So we had to kind of shift subject. But, you know, I probably spent 45 minutes talking to this little girl, and her sister made me a bracelet that 2.5 years later I still have on. And I asked her, though, I said, where did you learn English? Like, you speak fantastic English. Did your dad teach you English? Because he spoke very good English, and this was the guy that had been working for the contractor that got in trouble. And he said, well, he taught me a little, but most of it I've learned here, which I found really interesting, because nobody in my hotel spoke English. So I was like, well, how did you learn English here? And she pointed up to the router, and she said, I watched Sesame Street. And I thought, yep, that's why I do that. Yeah. That's why I do that every day long. And so, you know, then she starts off on C is for cookie, you know, and all the stories we know. You know, we sat there on the side of the track in this dilapidated, you know, arena, and I thought, you know, it's I'm not feeding this child. I'm not clothing this child. I can't solve the trauma that this child has been through, but she's got a skill now, and frankly, a self-possession and confidence that very few kids in her situation back home would have had. And so, do I wish that she hadn't ended up there? Absolutely. Am I proud of the work that we did that let her find a place where she's going to be successful? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that what was really interesting for me is when I was in Afghanistan, there were 2 young women with the UN who were kind of our shepherds, and one was 17 and one was 18, and they were unfortunately the most mature 17, 18-year-olds I had ever met. You know, I mean, probably were never children, because they had been displaced and all the conflict that was happening in their country. And yet, you know, they were so hopeful, and they were still girls. You know, they fixed each other's hair before they went somewhere. They had spats in front of us. You know, so you had these glimmers of little girls who were really little girls, but they had to be little women through the process. But they both completed the Network Academy course. And have gone on to do other things. So you see that, and what I find is the people who have the least or have the most generous hearts. They always invite you into their homes, and they're barely making it, but they offer you the best that they have, and I think that really touches you very deeply. Okay, so this unfortunately is the end, but I'm going to be very shameless and do a little plug for you. These are 2 amazing women, but there are a lot of amazing women and men in this world, and part of our whole global problem solvers is that we see the excitement of what digital technology and the digital revolution can do. But there's also a fear that I have that it will widen the gap, that, you know, will these technologies make those of us who can have more, and those of us who can't have less. And so this is why we really wanted to look on the other side of this, is that how do we enable everyone to take advantage of the technologies as they become available? And so the global problem solvers, we have multiple ways that we're going to do that to positively impact 1 billion people with digital solutions. And one way is the inner entrepreneur, the innovators. And so we have 3 great entrepreneurs downstairs in the social impact zone. And they each have a little, product that they would like to take to market. One is 2 women who came out of Columbia University, and they came up with a neonatal headband, and it has sensors. And what it does is it actually monitors infants' vital signs. Those ones who are in the, in the neonatal intensive care units. So looking like heart rate and body temperature, respiration, and all of that. It takes a nurse or a caregiver 5 to 6 minutes per baby. So if you're in a ward and you have 40 babies, one could be dead by the time you got back around to it. So what this does is in under-resourced hospitals, it'll actually, test that and alert a caregiver. So she's down there. And we actually were in Uganda and got to meet the doctor who will be piloting that with the support of the government. Then you have .learn, and what they do is that education, right now with the need for bandwidth, because great education is available, but you need a lot of bandwidth. And in many underdeveloped countries, they don't have enough bandwidth to download this. So what they do is they do some vector encoding to be able to shrink it down and be able to enable them to get access to curriculum using 2G and sometimes 3G. And then the third is a group who's focused primarily working on the industrial manufacturing sector. And what happens is that if the oil that they use in the machinery there's problems with it, it causes a thing called friction. And that friction emits a lot of CO2, a lot of CO2 gases. And also it reduces the productivity. And they have a sensor and software that can test the oil so they can immediately change it. And so not only are they helping the industrial manufacturers have more productivity, they also believe that over the next 15 years they can reduce the CO2 emissions from friction by 3 billion tons. So we're going to go from 8 to 5. And the reason we're showcasing this is that we want to launch a whole generation of entrepreneurs and innovators who can actually take the digital technology and do something that addresses social issues or society issues, but at the same time, they're a thriving business. And so the winner will get $25,000 from Cisco, so they can then take the next step in getting their products out there. And so all of you can vote. If you go down there, you can get a demo of their products. And then on Thursday, Guillermo Diaz, our CIO, will, as he's doing the closing, will announce the winner of that. We also have a question of the day. So today's question is, what would you do with digitization to reduce climate change? And it's a virtual wall, and somebody's going to win a VR headset. So there's lots of ways to get engaged. So make your way down to the social impact sites on the first floor when the buses are coming in, and you might make a friend. And there's some things that that you might just give them a few tips here and there, and they'll be there for you. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.